Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Angela Greiling-Keene. I'm a reporter for Bloomberg News, where I cover transportation, and the 106th president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through our programming with events such as this, while fostering a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit our website at www.press.org. To donate to programs offered to the public through our National Press Club Journalism Institute, please visit press.org/institute. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker today and those of you in the audience. Our head table includes guests of our speaker, as well as working journalists who are club members. And if you hear applause in our audience, I would note that members of the general public are also attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. You can follow the action today on Twitter using the hashtag NPCLunch. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have a question and answer session. I will ask as many questions as time permits. Now it's time to introduce our head table guests. I'd ask each of you to stand briefly as your name is announced. From your right, Ross Capon, President and CEO, National Association of Railroad Passengers. Todd Tranowski, editor of Argus Rail Business. Larry Willis, Secretary-Treasurer of the Transportation Trades Department of the AFL-CIO. William Cassidy, Senior Editor of the Journal of Commerce. Ed Hamburger, President and CEO of the Association of American Railroads. Allison Fitzgerald, Finance and Investigative Reporter at the Center for Public Integrity and the Chairwoman of the Speakers Committee at the Press Club. Skipping over our speaker for just a moment, Matt Molnarchuk, President of Advocatus Group, LLC, and the member of the Speakers Committee who organized today's lunch. Thank you, Matt. Jim Weinstein, Executive Director of New Jersey Transit. Herb Jackson, Washington correspondent for the Bergen Record. Michael Yessis, Editor-in-Chief of AOL Travel. And Christopher Chambers, Professor of Media Studies at Georgetown University. Our guest today is not shy about criticizing the hand that feeds him, saying federal spending on rail and other transportation needs is insufficient to the point that we're, quote, eating our assets alive. Joseph Boardman has been president and chief executive officer of Amtrak since 2008. Last year, the railroad's board said it was so happy with his work that it was extending his contract by another 2 years. During his tenure, Amtrak ridership has risen to a record 31.2 million in the 2012 fiscal year. Mr. Boardman told Congress last year that in FY12, Amtrak covered 88% of its operating costs and gained passengers along all routes, even on the long-distance trains that traditionally have battered the company's bottom line and that the Bush administration tried to cut. A 2013 Brookings Institution report said Amtrak ridership had increased 55% since 1997, more than double the growth realized by the domestic aviation sector. Nowhere is that more clear than on the busy Northeast corridor, which has grabbed market share from the airline shuttles. But all isn't rosy with those hordes of passengers. On a good day, they may complain about spotty Wi-Fi during their rides. On a bad day, such as earlier this week, they may be stranded for hours when equipment fails in winter weather. Prior to his appointment as the head of Amtrak, Mr. Boardman was the administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration, the agency that regulates rail safety for Amtrak and all other railroads operating in the U.S. Before the FRA, Mr. Boardman served as commissioner of the New York State Department of Transportation beginning in 1997, where he was the organization's longest-serving commissioner. He served in the U.S. Air Force in Vietnam beginning in 1968. After returning stateside, he enrolled at Cornell University, where he earned exactly the type of degree you would expect for someone bound to be one of America's transportation leaders, a Bachelor of Science in agricultural economics. Mr. Boardman is a vocal advocate of positive train control, a technology that's been in the news lately for its potential to prevent train crashes. He has said that Congress, the Federal Railroad Administration, and the entire passenger and freight rail industry must redouble their commitment, providing funding and implementing PTC as soon as possible. He is also a proponent of improving transportation infrastructure, saying that besides funding for rail infrastructure, the federal government must increase capital investment for a new air traffic control system, rebuild bridges and highways, improve and expand waterways, and many other types of critical infrastructure, such as our electric grid, water and sewage systems, and our communication systems. He'll talk about that theme today in a speech titled, Bringing Transportation Funding into the 21st Century. Please join me now in giving a warm National Press Club welcome to Amtrak President and CEO, Joseph Boardman.
Thank you, Angela. I'm really pleased to be here today with all of my friends as I look across the audience here. And I'd like to make sure I introduce one other person. He's the person that replaced me as the administrator for the Federal Railroad Administration. Joe Szabo, thanks for being here today. So, Angela, I started the first part of the speech telling you a little bit about the fact at 17 that I joined the Air Force and celebrated my birthday of 18 years old by having a drink. And then later, when I turned 21, I was able to vote. That's all reversed today, isn't it? So what we're going to talk about, or what I want to really talk about, is 3 weeks ago I became 65 years old, and I told Jim, one of my good friends here, Jim Weinstein, that I'm now an old man. He said, no, 65 is not old. He said, I'm 67 and I'm not old. But that's reversing as well in this nation, and there are other things that we need to start thinking about. In the most recent discussions that we really had about the future of surface transportation in America, it's focused on what's called the Highway Trust Fund and its authorization or reauthorization. I think that's probably unfortunate because the Highway Trust Fund, folks, is dead. It's financially unviable, but perhaps more importantly, I believe it's built on an outmoded vision for mobility in the United States. We need to be thinking about how to replace it with a surface transportation program for the 21st century. To do this, we need to start out by asking ourselves what the purpose of the program should be, what we wish to accomplish with it, and how we'll structure the program and its partnerships to produce a coherent, integrated transportation policy. I say we need to start here because when I look at today's disjointed collection of federal transportation programs, I can't find rational answers to these questions. And as they really say, if you don't know where you're going, good luck getting there. Tom Howard, the IG, tells me that all the time. It's clear to me that people no longer know what they're buying when they're asked to support federal transportation investments. And frankly, that confusion is justified. What is it that we are out to do? Maintain the network, improve it, expand it? I'm going to talk today about what I think we should do with our federal transportation program and a little about how Amtrak could fit into it. To start, we have to finally replace this notion of the highway program with the notion of a surface transportation program. It is not easy. We started 20 years ago with the ICE-T program, if you remember, when we really started talking about intermodal transportation. And as Angela said that there was my responsibilities in New York, well, when you were in the rural parts of New York, even though you wanted your residencies to answer the phone DOT, you got Highway Department when you call, because they think about it as the Highway Department, not as a DOT, not for what we need to do. We need a mode-neutral program that provides investments and projects that deliver real results rather than projects that simply invest on the basis of a historical perspective. We need a balanced program that can provide investment on any of our surface modes, highway, transit, or rail, freight or passenger. And it would unshackle our transportation planners, our system users, and other decision makers from simply chasing mode-restricted dollars and instead ask them to produce results that matter to the nation. And what are those results? A new focus on truly national priorities that must be the guiding principle of the federal surface transportation program. The overarching objective of our transportation policies and infrastructure investments must be our economic future, because we're competing in a new global marketplace. To build a program around this goal and others worthy of federal attention, we need to change the debate. As leaders, and we must pay our debt to the future and focus the industry on promoting economic growth. We must help keep our great country moving forward. I've been president of Amtrak since November of 2008, just over 5 years ago, and I was a young 59 then. At that time, the company, with the support of our federal and state, and since that time, the company, with the support of our federal and state partners, the women and the men that work for Amtrak, have achieved some impressive accomplishments, despite the recession and the slow growth of recovery from it. We've set ridership records in 10 of the last 11 years, and we carry 3 times as many passengers between New York and Washington as all the airlines put together. When's the last time you heard somebody say they just flew in on the shuttle? Amtrak revenues are up 21%. In Angela, we're now covering 89% of our operating costs from non-federal revenues instead of the 88%. It's been a great time to be at Amtrak. I'm happy that our growth indices continue to rise, but the fact of the matter is that we're constantly being asked by everyone, rural communities to the nation's biggest city, to deliver more and better service. State and local leaders see passenger rail as a driver of economic development and are finding ways to invest in their local train stations. Many towns without intercity rail service are seeking to become Amtrak-served communities. Air service is gone. Bus service is gone. Communities all over this country are starving for tangible transportation improvements that can meaningfully impact their lives. And in many key respects, transportation has gotten worse for many Americans and more expensive. And they want to see that tide and see if it'll turn. This isn't an Amtrak problem. It's a national problem. And it's symptomatic of the declining emphasis we're putting on national connectivity in recent decades. We've become myopic, not understanding the need for a united vision for the United States. You see many of the same challenges in the airline business. Their domestic capacity has fallen about 20% since 2005, and about half of the airline flights on routes of less than 500 miles have been discontinued since 2005. And it's hitting small and mid-sized communities hard and making it difficult for them to grow or even to do business outside town limits. Under these circumstances, you might think that strengthening national connectivity between our communities and our economic centers would be a national priority. But if you thought that, you'd be wrong. It's not. We're not really making the investments we need for growth and improvement. We're just barely keeping the existing system growing. Amtrak, like everyone else in the transportation business, is trying to keep pace, but it's a challenge. We have to make do, cramming more into the existing infrastructure and squeezing out more of old, hard-run equipment. The AEM-7s are almost at 4 million miles. The new trains can't, or new motors can't come fast enough, Siemens. and missing the real growth opportunities is what happens when that occurs. This year, Congress and the administration will take up reauthorization of the federal funding of surface transportation. I've got a somewhat unique perspective on that issue because I've seen surface transportation from almost every side. I think the only thing that maybe Angela left out here is I actually drove bus and tractor trailer in college, and I have a pilot's license. But I did begin my career in managing transportation in small cities in upstate New York, Rome, Utica, Binghamton, then owned my own company and managed rural communities throughout the state of New York. And as the State of New York Commissioner of Transportation, I was responsible for all facets of transportation at the third largest state in the country. When I was a kid, it used to be the largest population of the state, but that's changed as well. But my biggest responsibility was building and maintaining highways. As Federal Railroad Administrator, I was responsible for the safety of our nation's rail system, for federal rail policy, and for overseeing federal funding to Amtrak. And as President of Amtrak, I've spent the last 5 years figuring out what capital investments Amtrak needed to make to operate safely, to maintain the Northeast Corridor and our trains and stations, and to meet the growing national demand for our service, always without knowing how much money I'd have the next year, often in the current year, to meet all those needs. These experiences have given me some perspective on the challenges of transportation policy, and I'd like to offer you some of my thoughts on what I've seen and what I think needs to be done. The Highway Trust Fund was established in 1956 to pay for what was then our country's single greatest transportation goal, the construction of 47,000-mile interstate highway system. It was a real vision. It was authorized in 1944, but the real genesis of the system may be the trip Major Dwight Eisenhower made across the United States in 1919 with an Army convoy at an average daily speed of 5 miles an hour. The good road movement that followed that of the 20s and 30s greatly improved these roads, but in most places, they followed the trails that hunters, trappers, and wagons had made a century before. The interstate system, however, by contrast, was a new kind of road built and financed on a truly national scale to take advantage of the mobility trucks and cars were able to provide after 6 decades of development and to promote a new kind of commerce in an unprecedented scale. It was originally funded by federal appropriations and the federal gas tax, which pooled incremental tax revenue from users through the Highway Trust Fund to leverage massive multi-decade program. Today, however, the Highway Trust Fund is dead. What we think of as a Highway Trust Fund, a user fee-funded single mode and purpose-built trust fund, hasn't existed for many years. Construction of the interstate highway system was substantially completed in 1992, and we have since expanded funding eligibility. Today, the Highway Trust Fund pays mostly for maintenance of 220,000 miles of highway, less than a quarter of which are part of the 47,000-mile interstate highway system. Local transit was made eligible for funding in 1992, but illogically, intercity public transportation is still not eligible. User fees, federal gas taxes, no longer cover the costs funded by the Highway Trust Fund. Since 2008, Congress has spent more to bail out the Highway Trust Fund with general revenues than it spent on Amtrak for the whole of its 42 years of existence. And without intervention, projected deficits continue to grow for the Highway Trust Fund. A recent CBO study concluded that the shortfall in the fund will grow from $7 billion in 2015, that's next year, to $126 billion in 2023, just 8 years from now. The current authorization for surface transportation programs, a 2-year stopgap law known as MAP 21, expires this year, giving us an opportunity to create a new framework for federal transportation investment. We need to think about it because there's major issues pending. Those shortfall numbers, $126 billion by 2023, don't even include a lot of things America needs. For example, the recent proposal by the Reason Foundation to create an Interstate 2.0, a system that will address congestion and infrastructure age issues on the existing system, would cost nearly $1 trillion. And they think that needs to happen within the next 2 decades. If we treat the issue as what do we do within the existing structure, we will all lose. Nothing worthwhile will change. The question we as Americans must answer: how do we redefine the approach to federal transportation investment to ensure it's focused on truly national needs? How do we recapture the national vision and purpose of the interstate era? First of all, as I've said, forget about the notion of the Highway Trust Fund. The America of the future will not prosper on the backs of the best highways, airports, or railroads in and of themselves. A world-leading economy today requires a world-leading transportation system. So the new trust fund must be mode neutral, a transportation trust fund that strengthens the whole network and recognizes and supports the unique roles that each of our modes play in supporting interstate commerce and connectivity. Second, in the context of limited revenue, the trust fund must be focused on making investments that are truly national in scope and responsibility and generate policy outcomes the nation needs. It may be that certain things which are being funded today should not or cannot be funded in the future by the federal government if they lack a specific national purpose. That's not to say they're not worthwhile, but it's not enough anymore to ask ourselves whether certain investments are worth making. That's the easy way out. The right question, the tough question, is what investments is the federal government responsible for? Moreover, what investments is the federal government uniquely suited to provide? In my view, the fundamental purpose of federal transportation investment is to connect this nation together and provide for interstate commerce. That was the vision of our founding fathers in the Constitution. It was the vision behind the Highway Trust Fund. It's a vision we've lost today. Only the federal government can address this need for national connectivity. Only the federal government has the responsibility for providing the national perspective. These solutions should rise or fall on their merits. With every program, every investment, we must ask and answer how it provides for national connectivity and other national priorities, but how it addresses this fundamental and unique federal responsibility. We shouldn't be afraid of the notion of subsidy. Anyone who knows anything about transportation knows subsidy is ubiquitous. It's a part of the business because the public at large derives benefits from a strong transportation network. And frankly, it's how the National Highway System was sold in 1992 to 5. The key is making those subsidies as small as necessary to deliver broader long-term public value. The need to reauthorize surface transportation programs and Amtrak, whose authorization expired last year, provides an opportunity for us to ask, what role do we want the federal government to play in funding transportation infrastructure investment? And how can we formulate national policies that achieve the outcomes we need to meet the challenges of the 21st century economy? If national outcomes are our goal, I believe that investments in Amtrak have a home in a redefined, well-targeted surface transportation program. But that's up to the policymakers to decide. This isn't about what's best for Amtrak. Some may think redefining our approach to transportation investment may produce winners and losers, but that's the wrong way to think about it. The right way to think about transportation is as a tool for producing national outcomes. To forge it, we make some important choices. Choices that go deeper than continuing to do something because it's the way we've always done it. Like all of you, I have a lot of concerns about the course we're on. I've seen how government's ability to make targeted, effective investments has declined. Other people have noticed that too, and their confidence in government has declined right along with it. The people out there, customers, constituents, citizens, taxpayers, want us to deliver good, relevant infrastructure solutions. We're a mixed group, but we can't be a mixed-up group. And we have a challenge to meet, one that we can't afford to dodge or neglect. We have to improve our reality rather than just try to explain our reality. We're facing a real challenge, and the bankruptcy of the Highway Trust Fund is just the tip of the iceberg. This is not an insoluble problem, however, if we're willing to work together to solve it. Together, we must devise a forum where the right debate can be framed. It won't be easy, but if we strive in good faith, we can find a way through to a solution that will give America what it needs and help us restore the trust that must return for an appropriate level of investment in our nation's infrastructure needs. We who have spent a lifetime in this business owe this. A better and a stronger system to the generation behind us. We owe a debt forward. I believe we can do it, and we must. Thank you.
Thank you. Former Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood earlier this week called for raising the gas tax by 10 cents a gallon, as well as indexing the gas tax to inflation. Of course, that's not the message he was delivering a year ago when he was still Transportation Secretary. But within that context of that being part of the conversation this week, what do you think needs to be done in terms of the Highway Trust Fund as a pot of money? Does it need to be larger?
And I knew that the question would come. In fact, Steve told me it would come. So I thought about it, and I really think that where we are today, and one of the things I talked about in my speech, Angela, was that the Reason Foundation thought this ought to be done with automatic tolling for those of you that looked at it. But that's not the real question here, and I tried to put that in the speech. The real question here is, what are our priorities going to be? How are we going to decide what to do for the future? The Highway Trust Fund shouldn't be re-trusted. It should have a Surface Transportation Trust Fund and talk about us being a global competitor for the future. We hear a lot of, and I'll stop answering in a minute, but we hear a lot of criticism about not having high-speed rail or not having this or not having that in the nation. But we don't do anything about it except talk about it. We need to improve our reality here. We need to find a solution to a global competitiveness for transportation.
So is increasing the revenue part of the solution?
Is what?
Increasing the revenue, either through gas tax or some other means, part of that solution?
Well, interestingly, I think that it's already happening because the states are needing to make changes, and they're already out there. They're borrowing, they're tolling, they're finding solutions to the problem because the leadership is not coming from the federal government. And if the federal government understood that its responsibility was to connect this nation together first and foremost, the connectivity of this nation was what drove the interstate highway system. The connectivity of our small towns to the big towns is absolutely critical in this nation.
So states are raising, as you said, both gas taxes and tolls and doing public-private partnerships. Should the federal government be following the lead of the states on those things?
Well, the federal government did do that, didn't they, in the PREA law? They required Amtrak to go out and FRA to go out and and tell the states that they had to have a greater role in how they would finance state corridors. And that's okay. And there have been some suggestions that you could do that on a national basis on intercity passenger rail. But that's not okay, because that's our federal responsibility. That's something that we have a United States for.
How would you handicap the prospects of both a surface transportation bill, highway bill this year, as well as the chances for an Amtrak reauthorization? And do you see those two bills as linked, or can they move independent of each other?
Well, obviously, I see them as linked, because that's what I want to see, as a surface transportation program. I think that, it took a long time to even get to MAP 21. It wasn't just a quick analysis, and it was only 2 years. But for Amtrak, 2 years would be a major improvement. If you don't know what you're going to have next year, but not only don't you know what you're going to have next year, you don't know what you're going to have this year. It's hard to do a multifaceted major program, which is what's needed. We have a commission now on the Northeast Corridor. We've defined the work that needs to be done. You can't build a tunnel in 3 months. You can't rebuild a bridge. You can't do the things that we're being asked to do with the commitment level that we're receiving. So I think you need to bring it all together, and you need to have this mode-neutral solution, and we will rank well in that area. Highways are important. Aviation is important. Our electrical grid is important. Our water is important. Those things that we as a nation need to get done, we need to get it done. Thank you.
Why shouldn't the modes compete for funding? You're a railroad CEO calling for effectively more money for planes and highways also. Why do that?
Because we become stronger in the globe if we work together and balance our transportation system so that it does bring us better economic development and connects our people.
You noted that Amtrak has increased its covering its operating costs to 89% from 88%. Do you see that rising higher? And if so, how high can it go? Can it go to 100?
It depends on who writes the next speech. No, I'm kidding. It's really am kidding about that. I do see it increasing, but at the same time, what we're going to see relatively soon here is the investments that we're making in new equipment is going to begin to cost us more money, which means that some of the revenues that we have today will be used to pay off those debts and not be used to give back to the federal government.
Is there a goal of getting to 100%?
Is there a goal to get to 100% for the whole system, highways and aviation, or just Amtrak? Are we singling that back out again here? I think that we are and can be profitable above the rail with operating where we have enough ridership and where we can price our product. We can price our product today, and I know that because Chris told me that, and that we ought to have a way to deal for students, have a deal for students. In my discussion with him, I began to explain to him that we're full in capacity, and so the megabuses of the world and the bus systems that provide those services to the students is an important part of the balance here. Those buses, and I was in the bus business, are subsidized. Even if they don't get a government check, every time they use the interstate highway system, every time they use what's out there already for police, and I've got the best police chief and deputy right here in the back of the room, the communities pay for those. We pay for those costs as a railroad.
Given the current strained, at best, fiscal environment in Washington, what ideas do you propose to reduce Amtrak's operating costs? And the questioner asks, to what extent would you welcome competitive contracting as a way to accomplish that?
Well, yesterday, I understand we have a new contractor up in Boston. There was a decision to move to a new commuter rail operator. One removed from that was Amtrak a few years ago. We see that there is a competitive environment out there in the commuter rail business, And we've stepped back substantially from that, except for where it really makes sense for Amtrak to operate it where it owns the railroad. For example, in Maryland and in Connecticut service that we provide for commuter rail. And there are a few other places that really want Amtrak in there. We can't operate as cheaply as a company coming in like this is a French company that came in here, because they set up a small company where the liability isn't exactly the same and the cost isn't exactly the same. So in those areas where it makes sense, they're going to compete with us. In other areas, you're not going to have that competition because of the huge investment that it's going to take and the liability that's out there that we have to cover.
Speaking of the strained fiscal climate in Washington, DOT appropriations run out in 6 days. Paint for us the picture of what happens with Amtrak if that happens, and as one step beyond that, what happens if there's another extended government shutdown?
Well, we lost ridership when there was a government shutdown, so we don't want that to happen because we do provide quite a bit of ridership out there. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that that's part of the malaise at the federal level of lack of commitment to what we need to get done for our country. I wasn't kidding when I said that I think we owe more debt forward than we really owe back in this nation, because we have benefited greatly, those of us that are in this age category, from the investments that have been made in this country. When I lived in Washington, D.C. in 1966 and 1967, there was only part of the way that I could get home to Rome, New York on an interstate highway. I had to get off the interstate and go through the cities. And now that doesn't really happen anywhere in this nation. The investments were made. We are gaining and have gained from those investments. What we need for the future is not to worry about those things so much, because what they really need to worry about is where are their kids and grandkids going to be if we don't make investments for the future that'll allow them to be part of this global economy. We'll be the offshored people.
This questioner says, innovators like Elon Musk, a former National Press Club Luncheon speaker, have proposed new means of transportation. Are you working with him or other visionaries?
I'd like to get the existing trains replaced so that they don't break down. We have a higher level of reliability so that the job that we really do well gets done even better. It's important to have these ideas. I understand that, and I'm not being critical of them. But there's a huge cost and a huge change in culture that would have to occur for that. We don't have the culture today to deliver even a single surface transportation program that we can then have decisions made on a mode-neutral basis.
Speaking of replacements, what's the prognosis for a new tunnel under the Hudson River that could take traffic off the George Washington Bridge? Or maybe you want a tunnel to Fort Lee, New Jersey?
I promised my friend Jim that would not come up. But I knew Angela would get it there somehow. The prognosis is it's got to be done. I mean, if Sandy taught us nothing else, except the fact when you have water in the two tunnels that we have, you can't run trains and you can't move people. And we need greater redundancy. And if we're going to remain as the financial capital of the world in New York City, we better start being more serious about doing that. Building those tunnels and building the Gateway program, making sure there's space for trains that just keep coming from his railroad into New York. They just keep coming. You know, there is no question today that we have to make these investments. We've got to find solutions. Part of the solution is the federal government. Part.
Governor Christie is talking a lot about transportation this week. Is now a good time to get him on board for the tunnel project?
Pass.
Passengers this week in the Northeast were either stuck on trains for hours or prevented entirely from taking trips because their trains were canceled due to the weather. A lot of problems with the overhead catenary wires. Can you talk about what was different this time? Cold weather happens in January, and what happened, and what does that tell us about our infrastructure needs?
I think it wasn't just the Northeast, so that everybody understands. We had a huge number of problems out in the Midwest. We had one of our trains, Train 6, run into a 20-foot snowdrift and got stuck in there, and the train that went to rescue him got stuck in another snowdrift earlier than that, and we depended upon our very good partners, the freight railroads, to help us out, and they did help us out. They moved us and substantially. And we received tons of compliments about our conductors, and I'll mention her name, and I know she'll be red-faced, Andrea. I'll just mention her first name. The conductor on Train 6 absolutely was an outstanding person to deliver for her customers. And the interesting thing is I started getting questions about, what about this train that's stuck for 24 hours? You're getting people telling you how well you're handling these problems, the people that are actually there, but the way that it's reported, it sounds like we're having other major problems. We have women and men of this company that deliver every single day, and while they're not perfect, they're the ones that are responsible for the success we've really had, and it's the weather that happens, that has been happening this past couple of weeks, that you really get to know who's worth their salt, and we have a lot of them that are. In terms of the problem on the Northeast Corridor, there has been a growing, what we would call, or our engineers would call, hardware incidents or breakdowns happening more and more every year. The catenary, the wire, most of the wire problem was south of New York because the wire north of New York was built and is relatively new, built in the 90s, and it's constant tension catenary instead of the way that the catenary used to be tightened on the south end, which was built back in the 30s. It's getting too old. And so we're having more and more breakdowns. There needs to be a rebuild of that entire system.
Do you have a price tag for that?
Yes.
What is it?
Rather than try to give it to you, I'd provide that differently. I don't have all the numbers in the back of my head, but it's not cheap.
Airlines have a legal obligation to accommodate displaced passengers when there's flights canceled due to their equipment problems. Amtrak doesn't have a comparable mandate. Should there be a mandate for rail passengers like that?
Well, we do try to take care of our customers when something like that happens. So we do have a system in place that does that. And I think what you were asking, whether there should be a mandate or not, some would think so, others might not. But one of the things that we did do is try to give people as early a notice as we could during this storm so that they'd know that they couldn't travel. And even then, you know, sometimes our trains are on the tracks for a couple of days before we know that the storm is going to be that bad. So another one of the questions you have to field once you stuck a train out in Minn Kota, Illinois, is why did you have it out there? Well, because it left the West Coast a couple of days ago, and there wasn't this kind of a problem really expected at that point. So it's a little different than the flight that hops over for a couple of hours than it is for handling train traffic.
Speaking of airlines, they've of course earned extra cash by charging for seats with more legroom, for checking luggage. We could go on and on. Airlines also have multiple service classes and charge a large premium for the top classes. With Amtrak trains being more crowded and often sold out, is this something Amtrak's considering for revenue?
We're looking at all those kinds of things, Angela. We're looking at how we might be able to raise revenues, and I know that, again, in some of my discussions in the meeting before I came in here, we really talked about there was a desire on a lot of people for us to reduce fares rather than have the fares where they are or increase them. We actually survey and look at what's happening on a revenue management level, just like the airlines do, every day. We're really looking for the opportunity to increase our revenues, and that's why you see an increase of 21%, or part of the reason why you're seeing that increase in revenue, because we're managing our revenues very differently today than we've ever managed them in the past. And we're looking at those other opportunities as well. We have 55 new baggage cars that are coming on board here in the next year or so. And so we get the requests for handling different objects. And there's a bill in Congress for us to be handling pets at this point in time too. So there are some opportunities that are coming forward for us for the future. We're looking at what the elasticity ratios might be that we could increase our revenues to our customers and seeing what they would be interested in paying. So yeah, those are the kinds of things we are looking at.
We have a couple questions about Amtrak customer service. This questioner asks, what steps are you planning to address Amtrak's inconsistent levels of customer service, characterizing it as sometimes wonderful, sometimes maddeningly bureaucratic?
Well, I think that everybody in this business has that problem to some extent, and that's not an excuse. We are doing something about that. We're looking at how do we provide the training, how do we provide incentives for our employees. But what you really want in any kind of a service business is you really want those who gain from the service itself and not, they're really somebody who really wants to provide service to begin with. So we're also trying to figure out how to select the right people and hire the right people up front to make sure that we're providing a service. The other thing that we found that Amtrak, it brings up really a larger issue. And that is, I was thinking as you were saying you were the 106th president of the National Press Club, that I was the 106th president of Amtrak. Because that's sort of what's happened at Amtrak. With 42 years, I'm now the second longest serving Amtrak president at a little over 5 years, with Graham Claytor being the longest one. And so you think about the average change that's occurring for the flavor of the month. And so one of the issues that I had to look at when I first got there is how do I really get folks understanding that we want a safe railroad, that we want good customer service, that we want a better bottom line. And so there's all sorts of things that have to change. Some of them are business processes. Some of them are the trust that you need with the women and men that you work with and that you want them to be happy about. How do you give good customer service if you're not giving good employee relations, if you're not delivering to your folks the things and the values that are out there that are necessary? So we needed a strategic plan to establish those values, to find the things that we knew were important, including forgiveness, including understanding that somebody might need that forgiveness to move on to the next level. And that has helped us. But we haven't got the consistency we would like yet for customer service, and we're still working on it.
What about food? A questioner who calls him or herself a foodie and a frequent Amtrak passenger says that the quality of food on Amtrak is, quote, subpar at best. Questioner asks, how tough is it to serve a decent sandwich that doesn't look like it was prepared and shrink-wrapped 4 days before being served? And what are Amtrak's plans to improve food quality?
Well, I sort of like Amtrak food. I live in Rome, New York, and it takes a long time on Amtrak to go from Rome, New York to Washington, and that's how I travel generally, is from Washington to New York, and then from New York to Albany usually, and I park an old Xterra up in Albany so I can drive over to Rome because there's not enough service. There ought to be more service west of Albany. Have you heard that anywhere here? But I couldn't do it. And I usually eat on the train. I eat hamburgers, and I like their hot dogs, and I like Amtrak food, and I like it on the long distance trains. It's generally good. Some of this new panini or whatever you call it, and it sounds to me like that might be what he's talking about. I'm okay with that going myself, but we do have people that are focused on trying to improve food, and we'd like to make sure that that happens.
What about sky caps? This questionnaire calls them wonderful, but says they must be costly and a high-cost operation where competitors don't have them. How long can sky caps be justified at Amtrak?
Well, boy, I tell you, the red caps down here in Washington get their workout. They've finally learned that not everybody that's coming in the front door wants to go to Amtrak. Some of them want to go upstairs to the buses, and that wasn't part of the deal here. So we have a lot of people that absolutely need help with the amount of baggage and what they want to do to get on the trains. We see it as an important part of customer service on the train.
We have a bunch of questions on long-distance service, so let's make sure we get in one of those. Can you comment on the significance of those routes in the context of what you talked about today with the legislation you hope to see?
We serve over 500 stations in the United States. Over 300 of those stations have no other service than Amtrak. Buses are gone, aviation has had to cut back, and we are the public transportation in those communities. If you're somebody who is my age and has grandchildren, and your grandchildren are a little older than me and even older than Weinstein, and those grandchildren are on one coast or the other, you can probably get somebody to drive 100 miles or 200 miles to an Amtrak station, and almost, except for 2 routes that ought to be 7 days a week, but those 2 routes are 3 days a week, except for 2 routes, that train is going by there, going west or north or south or east every day, and you can depend on it. It might be a little late, but you can depend on it. It depends on whether one of Red's railroads gets us on time or not over there. But you can depend on it. But you can't depend on that neighbor to drive you 800 miles to the coast where your grandchildren are. The post office used to have, in fact, if you look at the top of the old post office next to the Union Station, one of the things it says is connector, and I might have the words wrong, of scattered families, because this country was growing and they used the post office to connect with their letters. Well, we do that today. We connect scattered families across this nation. We are a major part in bringing connectivity to the United States, coast to coast, border to over border into Canada, to deliver what this nation needs and has forgotten about, those people that don't have those services in this nation.
Speaking of the freight railroads, how would you characterize Amtrak's relationship with the freight railroads today, especially on positive train control implementation?
I think Amtrak's relationship with the freight railroads is excellent. We have very good partners with the freight railroads. They have a lot of pressures because they have had to downsize in a way to make themselves more competitive. Maybe a little further than they knew that they needed to, or found that they needed to. And so they're having to pick up some services now, especially with some new traffic they have. We have good relationships with our freight railroads. We don't want to pay them as much as they want to increase the number of routes that we want to provide, but that's part of the bargaining that it's really about. But when we're in trouble, they're there for us. We found that in Sandy. We found that in this latest storm when it was cold. We don't agree with them on everything, but what else is new? We have good relationships with our freight railroads.
And what about high-speed rail? You alluded to it before that people want it, but nobody wants to pay for it. What do you see, or do you see a future for high-speed passenger rail in the U.S.?
Did Allison write that question? Because we were talking about that a little earlier. High-speed rail, it depends on how you define high-speed rail. We're already high-speed rail in terms of the UIC, which is the International Association of Railroads. We're already doing that. And the largest majority of our operation along the Northeast Corridor is at 125 miles an hour, or 135 if you're riding in Nacella, or up to 150 if you're riding in Nacella. We incrementally see improvements where we're going to reduce the amount of time that it takes to get from Washington to New York and New York to Boston. And it's really about the time and the reliability that people really can depend on the railroad. They want it on time, and they want it to run all the time. They want it to run when we say we're going to run. But we also believe that we can build a railroad that's 220 miles an hour, and that if we do get that railroad built, that it will pay a substantial amount of money for us, for the railroad business, to invest in more for the future. So we see it as positive. But again, there are no high-speed railroads, none, that have been built without a large check being written by the federal government of the country that wants to build it. If you use, and I'm going to use this for just a minute, maglev, and Japan came over, the prime minister to come over to the United States and talked here in the United States. They were willing to write part of the big check to go from here, Washington, to Baltimore. Now, I read a recent article where it says it takes an hour on an existing train to go from Washington to Baltimore. And I looked up on the schedule and I said, wow, I didn't think it would take us that long. Well, it's 21 minutes on our schedule. So Acela had to be broke the day whoever wrote that article. So the problem here is that you can't build it 37 miles and then expect the investment to be made for the future. You're not going to get this multi-year effort to occur for high-speed rail unless we start thinking about a surface transportation program for the future that delivers that kind of multi-year contract authority. Contract authority is critically important for a transportation mode. And let me tell you what that is if you don't know what it is. That's the Highway Trust Fund. That's what it gave the states, the ability to do multi-year, multifaceted projects. In New York, once we knew that we had an environmental program or project, had the environmental process done, we knew we were going to build it because we knew where the money was going to come from. No such thing exists for rail. As a matter of fact, in our effort to look at high-speed rail for the Northeast Corridor, we needed to do an environmental study, which is what FRA is doing right now, is looking at that for the future. So if you ever did get some money for the future, you actually may be able to build it.
We are unfortunately almost out of time, but before asking you one last question, I have a couple of housekeeping matters to take care of. First of all, I'd like to remind you about our upcoming speakers. On January 15th, we have Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the IMF, and on January 22nd, DeMaurice Smith, the head of the NFL Players Association. Secondly, I would like to present Mr. Boardman with our traditional National Press Club coffee mug.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No money.
None. One last question. Many folks consider Amtrak's Twitter feed to be one of the best social media accounts out there. I know I follow it. How did it get started? Who runs it? And how do you think it's benefiting your passengers?
I love her like she was my daughter. Julia, stand up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Boardman, for coming today. Thank you to each of you in the audience. I'd also like to thank our National Press Club staff, including our Journalism Institute and Broadcast Center, for helping organize today's event. Finally, here's a reminder. You can find more information about the National Press Club on our website at www.press.org. You can also find transcript and video of today's program there. Thank you. We are adjourned.